Welcome to this explainer. When we picture the 19th century American West, we usually think of a romanticized landscape, right? Heroes, villains, saloon shootouts. But the reality? It was vastly different. It was a harsh, completely unyielding world. A landscape defined by this brutal, crushing isolation and the terrifying, absolute absence of any civil authority. Today, we're taking a journey into an era where survival was literally the only law. Order was something you had to build with your own two hands, and it often came at a terrible, terrible cost.
Just listen to these words. If you want to know what to do with a thief that you may find stealing, I say kill him on the spot. Spoken by a territorial leader, Brigham Young, back in 1853. These words really set the grim baseline reality for the era we're stepping into. This wasn't hyperbole, folks. This was a chilling fact of life. Out there on the ragged edge of expansion, the lines between right and wrong were just entirely blurred by the desperate need to survive.
I want you to imagine the sheer physical isolation of this environment. Imagine the sound of that biting, relentless wind howling across the plains. Feel that suffocating, dry dust coating your skin. You are days, maybe even weeks away from anyone who could possibly help you. Out here on desolate dirt roads just stretching into this vast expanse, you are entirely, frighteningly on your own.
Which brings us to part one, the empty expanse. Try to feel the psychological tension of living in a complete void. You're miles from any formal government, completely detached from any promise of protection. In short, there was no law. Let that stark truth hang in the air for a second. That vacuum of authority meant that every single man and woman venturing into this wilderness had to become their own protector. If someone took your property or threatened your life, there was no sheriff to call, no cavalry coming over the hill to save you. And you were living against a backdrop that was incredibly harsh. Breathtakingly beautiful, sure, but entirely indifferent to whether you lived or died. The visual brutality of the land itself, immense, treacherous, completely unforgiving, it really mirrored the human experience. This environment stripped away all the comforts of civilization and left those vulnerable pioneers and prospectors completely exposed.
So what does this all mean? Well, this absolute isolation birthed a necessary, though incredibly dark phenomenon known as frontier justice. It's essentially extrajudicial punishment motivated by the total non-existence of law and order, or just a deep dissatisfaction with it. Think about it. When you're standing in the middle of a desert and your life or your livelihood is stolen, desperate citizens felt they had absolutely no choice. They had to become the judge, the jury, and, ultimately, the executioner.
Moving into part two, the rise of vigilantes. Now, it's important to understand this didn't just start as pure anarchy. Actually, it began as early, seemingly justifiable attempts by miners and settlers to just establish some semblance of civilization in the dirt. Consider the contrast here. On one side, you have formal courts. If they existed at all, they were incredibly slow, hundreds of miles away, and honestly, often hopelessly corrupt. On the other side, you had these ad hoc tribunals, rapid, makeshift courts organized right around the campfire to punish thieves and highwaymen on the spot. Because if a man stole your horse, you certainly didn't have 6 months to wait for a circuit judge to show up.
And there was a sheer, brutal logic to this mob rule. In those crowded mining camps, these tribunals saved nascent communities precious time and money. The speed and ferocity of the punishments, typically flogging, banishment, or just straight-up hanging, they were explicitly designed for maximum deterrent effect. And here's the crazy part. At the time, newspaper editors and everyday citizens actually praised these swift tribunals. They viewed them as a triumph of civic duty, literally the only thing holding back total chaos.
But look at how rapidly this justice escalates. In 1851, the first San Francisco Committee of Vigilance is formed. By 1856, it's reorganized into a massive force. Fast forward to 1863, Montana citizens are forming armed committees, leading all the way up to legendary events like the 1882 erupt vendetta ride. Over just a few short years, those small campfire courts transformed. They became massive, highly organized, and heavily armed paramilitary vigilance committees.
This brings us to part three, the hangman's court.
By this point, frontier justice was shedding its survivalist roots. It was transforming into a dark, highly organized spectacle that was frighteningly swift and almost entirely lacking in due process. Look at this number, 6,000. That is the staggering number of men who joined the 1856 San Francisco Committee of Vigilance, 6,000 armed men. This brilliantly illustrates how quickly mob rule could just completely overtake a formal municipal government. We're not talking about a fringe group here.
It was the city itself, weaponized.
These committees really took on a chilling, militarized nature. They weren't meeting in canvas tents anymore. They operated from fortified headquarters, literally sandbagged with gunny sacks and actual cannons. They held secret trials. They even seized armaments intended for the state militia. They became the ultimate, unyielding face of frontier authority, completely unchecked by any higher power.
And this wasn't just happening in the cities. Out in the isolated deserts of Texas, you had eccentric individuals like saloon keeper Roy Bean. You might have heard of him. He famously proclaimed himself the law west of the Pecos, holding court right in his ramshackle Jersey Lily saloon. His rulings were deliberate and often completely bizarre, like he once fined a dead man $40 for carrying a concealed weapon. But behind that kind of dark humor was a grim reality. This was one man claiming absolute, unquestioned authority over life and death.
Which brings us to a profound historical warning from General W.T. Sherman. He actually witnessed the San Francisco mobs firsthand. He asks, who is to say that the Vigilance Committee may not be composed of the worst instead of the best elements of a community? It's a haunting question, isn't it? It foreshadows the inevitable corruption of unchecked power. Because when the mob seizes the government, who polices the mob?
Let's look at part 4, Blood in the Valleys.
This is the exact moment where the thin veneer of justifiable order shatters entirely. It plunges the frontier into factional violence, lynchings, and mass bloodshed. So I have to ask you, when does justice become murder? In the heavy silence of the frontier, this question really forces a psychological confrontation, because the moral line of the era completely disintegrated. What started out as protection morphed into something deeply, deeply sinister.
The sheer scale of the brutality here is staggering. You have the Johnson County War, where wealthy cattle barons fought homesteaders over open ranges. You have self-appointed stranglers lynching 60 alleged rustlers up in North Dakota. You have the horrific Sand Creek Massacre, where a Colorado militia slaughtered 200 Cheyenne. And there were just constant executions along the Utah borderlands. These weren't trials anymore. This was relentless, bloody war waged under the convenient excuse of justice.
20. That is the number of men lynched by the Montana vigilantes in a single purge back in 1863. And you know the most shocking part? That list included Henry Plummer. He was their own elected sheriff who had secretly been masterminding the stagecoach robberies the whole time. The lawmen and the outlaws were, very often, the exact same people.
The data really reveals a horrific disproportion during this era. Think about how nearly every transgression was handled. Theft of gold dust? Hanging. Horse and cattle rustling? Lynching. Even political opposition in San Francisco led to secret trials and executions. It didn't matter the severity of the crime, it didn't matter the proof. The answer was almost always the ultimate, irreversible punishment at the end of a rope.
Finally, part 5, the price of order.
As we bring this explainer to a close, we really have to reflect on the heavy psychological toll, the immense bloody price that was paid to establish civilization in the West. Because ultimately, the cure for lawlessness became as terrifying as the disease itself. A society pushed to the absolute brink had to employ savagery just to escape anarchy. It's a crushing paradox, and it completely defined the settlement of the American frontier.
These words were etched onto a lonely grave marker out in the Utah Territory. A.B. Baker, shot for horse stealing, July 1st, 1860. There was no trial, no jury, just a swift, violent end recorded on a piece of wood in the dirt.
And so, we return to the empty expanse. This dirt road holds the forgotten bones of a lawless past. It forces us to grapple with the brutal true stories of how the frontier was actually settled. It wasn't one with mere grit and romance. It was carved out in fear, in blood, and the terrifying reality of justice delivered at the end of a gun. So I'll leave you with this. What would you have done if you were entirely alone, out there in the dust?